It is a very exciting time in the world of interesting cars because some of the most significant racing cars in history are going across the auction block around the world this year. And I was actually starting a conversation with John Ficarra over the phone recently, and we both decided this might make a good VINwiki episode as we discuss some of these cars and the significance of their ownership. So, John, as always, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here, Ed.
And today's video is brought to you by Auto Tempest. Look, I know we talk a lot about Auto Tempest on VINwiki and on Car Trek and all of that, but you supporting Auto Tempest is the way that they keep supporting the content that we make. So please do right now, click the link in the description below, open up a tab in another window, and do go browse Auto Tempest for your next car. It certainly helps us, but it also helps you because it is the fastest and most powerful way to find your next car by reaching out to the deepest, darkest corners of the internet and bringing all the results back into one place. Autotempest.com, all the cars, one search. Please check them out. But the first car we're going to talk about is a car that you'll be very familiar with if you've been watching VINwiki for a while, and that is the Ferrari 250 LM. That is, I think, and probably a good argument, John, you'll make it, that is probably the most significant racing Ferrari ever.
I have to agree with you. Now, the reason for that is, and of course, I did a video on VINwiki about this car's amazing victory in the 1965 Le Mans. It is the last of the V12 Ferrari ever to win Le Mans. I know Ferrari just recently won Le Mans. Congratulations to them. But it had been since this car in 1965 that they hadn't won Le Mans. And this car wasn't even a factory car. It was a privateer car that was put out there by the U.S. team NART. And it really was the car that should never have won Le Mans. It was a secondary car. It wasn't even one of the front leaders. This was the year when Ferrari had out their prototypes, their factory prototypes. It also was the year that all the GT40s showed up and the Shelby Daytonas. Everything was against this car. It was the greatest underdog victory. You know, it's got to be one of the most significant Ferrari race cars of all time, which is saying something. And the fact is that we know it's this car because it was given to the Indianapolis Museum and it sat there for years and it was not destroyed, damaged, or burnt down. This is the car, and it is the Ferrari race car.
Exactly. And it is being sold by the Indy Museum. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what it means for anyone, a private individual, a manufacturer, or a museum to sort of own and caretake and curate the stories of some of these hugely significant automobiles and really what the transactions look like. Because right now, the Indy Museum is liquidating, I think, 11 of their most significant cars in the collection in order to finance a large renovation and rebuild of their facility at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And that, is a little bit shocking because some of these cars, particularly this one and a Mercedes we're going to talk about in a few minutes, are just so hugely amazing and such a great part of the experience of visiting the Indy Museum historically. And so it's a little hard to wrap your head around what it means for them to sell one, but also what it's going to mean for the buyers. So this car is being offered at RM Sotheby's auction in Paris in just a few days, and the estimate is 25 million euros, which at the moment the exchange rate is pretty similar. So $26 million as an estimate, or an in excess of, they say. Now, it's arguable that this is more significant to own than a 250 GTO, which has historically been either the most expensive car on the earth or at least the most expensive Ferrari on earth. And I think if I were to choose with imaginary money that I don't have, I'd much rather have this car and its story than one of the other. Obviously, the GTOs all race, they're all significant, but I think this is the one you want to show up to Cars and Coffee in. What do you think, John?
I have to agree. And they built fewer of these. Only built, I think, 32 LMs. The LM was going to be a privateer car. It was supposed to be the replacement for the 250 GTO. Ferrari kind of fudged the rules, and the engine went to mid end instead of being a front engine car. And they wanted to make a sports car, but it was a prototype. So its rarity is fantastic. This car's history obviously is amazing. Another LM sold for $17 million recently that didn't have this kind of history. And essentially, this is still from the days when prototype race cars are cars you could drive on the street. They had headlights, taillights, turn signals. So this is something you could drive to Cars and Coffee theoretically. And it's a much more significant car than a GTO. Now, I'm not taking anything away with the GTO. The GTO is absolutely legendary. And probably if just a regular LM were sitting there and a regular GTO were sitting there, the GTO is going to outperform it as far as value wise. But this is the 250 LM, and it is the Le Mans winner. So it should be. And again, GTOs sell for what they're selling for like $50 million now. I think the $25 million expectation on this is really low.
It is low. I mean, I could see the car doing 50, 75, but we are in a period of time where the appreciation of vintage cars is waning as the newest crop of entry into the car collecting world is generally targeting the Radwood era and newer cars. It doesn't mean that there aren't still a huge audience for every kind of sector of muscle cars and pre-war cars and everything else. It just means that there aren't that many new buyers coming into that pool, which would inherently elevate the values. And so, we'll talk a lot about a Jaguar soon that kind of reflects this attitude. I would love for this car to be worth more than a GTO. It's clearly not as pretty as a 250 GTO, and I mean, that's a big part of what it means to have a car that valuable sitting in whatever part of whatever collection or whatever museum it might live in. But for the person that's going to bid on this car, or may have already kind of created a preordained outcome of what might happen at the auction we're going to see in a few days, it's hard to imagine what life would be like driving around in a car that is that significant. And that's where I want to start talking about another car that recently went across the auction block at Mecum Kissimmee, the Porsche 917K that was billed as being owned by Jerry Seinfeld. And this car, all the news articles say that Jerry Seinfeld refused an offer or his car did not meet reserve with a bid of $25 million. Now, this is a car you're quite familiar with, John. So tell us about how significant this car actually is.
Well, the 917K, which is what this is, and it's a Golf car, was pretty much just we're talking about how the 250 LM is the amazing Ferrari race car. 917K is kind of the iconic Porsche endurance car. In 70 and 71, it won Le Mans, it won Daytona, it won Sebring, it won everything. It was absolutely dominant. It's fantastic to look at. It did everything right, and any version of it is going to be worth quite a bit of money. I got to work closely with a few of them when I was at Canepa, and they're amazing cars. Now, this car was used in the filming of Le Mans, the Steve McQueen movie. And then it moved on to Brian Redman, and it went on to, it actually did a little racing after Le Mans, some legitimate racing. And then it went on to Richard Atwood, and it moved on. We know the history of it all the way from the days of Solar Productions ownership. Again, this is about race cars. It's never been wrecked. It's never been destroyed. The chassis hasn't been replaced. There's a lot of 917s out there that are chassis 15 and chassis 31. And this one is chassis 22, just chassis 22. It's got an unassailable history. It's an amazing car. Now, Brian Redman, back in the day, in 1975, bought this car for 8,500 pounds, which in that money at that time was about $19,000.
I saw that as well, and I went ahead and plugged into an S&P calculator, and $20,000 in 1975, 50 years later, is $8 million. Now, there aren't that many cars that have beaten the stock market over any significant period of time, and I'm not sure that it would have beaten it terribly apart from the McQueen history. You can let me know your thoughts on that, but that is an impressive return regardless of what it's actually worth.
It's funny because Redmond sold to Atwood, I think, 2 years later after Redmond got injured for 30,000 pounds. So I'm sure he thought at the time he was making a bundle of money. As an investment, it would have been great if you had bought it back in the day and you kept it till today. But I think a lot of the value of this car is its McQueen ownership. There are actually still camera mounts in the car. Like, that's one of the ways of telling that this is the car from Solar Productions. There's still mounts inside the car from the shooting of it. You can go head to me on this, but I think the McQueen era is fading. The generation of McQueen worship is starting to fade away. There's a whole generation coming in that don't even know who he is. And I think this is a good time for Jerry to try to sell it, because I think we're not going to see McQueen's impact as significant as has been in the past, when his sunglasses sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars and his jumpsuit sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. That his effect on the price of a 917 isn't going to be as significant.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, his effect on the price of his Tag Heuer watch or his Rolexes and things like that is, 500 times or 1,000 times what they would have brought without his kind of affinity partnership with the product. And so, on a percentage basis, the influence on a car is not necessarily as significant, but it is very, very meaningful here. As is the fact that it's coming out of Jerry Seinfeld's collection, which is very easily argued as the most significant and impressive Porsche collection on Earth. Now, that's where I get to one of the hardest things for me to wrap my head around, obviously not owning any cars remotely this significant. But Jerry Seinfeld is not a person that needs money. He is not a person that is less interested in Porsche tomorrow than he is today. How do you decide to sell the most significant, and I'm pretty sure it would be the most valuable car in his collection?
I don't know why you would. I mean, the man's a billionaire, I'd assume at this point, and that car represents a minor amount of how much he's worth. But maybe it's just done. I mean, when you have these kind of cars, the ownership of them is only how much you enjoy them. And maybe he just doesn't use it anymore, he doesn't enjoy it anymore, or maybe he thinks it's time to move it on to the next owner or somebody who's going to use it. It's hard to say. I mean, he probably bought it. I think it sold in 2000 for like 1,300,000, and he bought it a year later. Let's say he bought it for $3 million. So whatever he's going to sell it for, he's going to make a ton of money on, not money that he actually needs. So I'm not at that strata where I can go like, well, I need to sell my $25 million 917. He has a tremendous amount of cars. He's got a lot of significant cars. I'm sure he's got cars that he enjoys every day. He loves driving his cars, and this is not a car he's going to be able to hop into and drive. And Jerry's also not a racer, so you're not going to see him out at Laguna Seca at the Historics blasting around the track in it. It just sits there, as far as I know. And he might take a parade lap here or there. So it's not something he drives and enjoys. Why not sell it?
I suppose, but and I think this was the first Porsche race car that he added to the collection at that point. And that makes sense, right? To broaden your road car collection into race cars. And certainly he can't drive every car that he owns, probably not even once a year, because there are so many of them. And I have heard the argument from people with these massive collections that will never in their lives or their grandchildren's lives need any money, say that the only circumstance in which they will sell a car is when they believe it is going to a better home. And that's a good argument, right? Like if you know you're not going to drive the car and it's just going to sit either in your warehouse or in your museum, but somebody else, that'll be the prize of everything they own and they're going to use it all the time. It's going to go to 20 events a year. Like that's a really good argument to let it go. That is not the argument to run it through a Mecum auction.
The Mecum auction I thought was an interesting choice. It's kind of the supermodel at a high school dance, right? Resto mod Camaros and things like that. But again, there's a small history to that as far as Mecum's concerned. When I was at Canepa in 2012, we helped revive the 91710 Chassis 3, the winner of the 72 Can-Am Championship, which was sold at Mecum in 2012 for, I think, $5.5 million. So they have done that kind of thing before. I can only imagine that it was at Mecum through some special arrangement that just was there to bring eyeballs to the auction. Maybe not with the expectation of actually selling it, but maybe helping sell a lot of other cars, which they did. They had a pretty successful auction.
And that's correct. And that's worth talking about because there is some speculation that Dana Mecum had already purchased the car or agreed to purchase the car from Jerry Seinfeld and that there was really no plan to sell the car. There's a lot of things in the world of public car auctions that are not entirely legitimate as they might be perceived to an unfamiliar viewer. And it's really important to understand that if there is a published reserve, if it's published that there is a reserve without letting people know what the reserve is, the auction house is allowed to bid up to that reserve against whoever is in the crowd. And so if there was a 25 million or a 30 million or a $100 million reserve on this car, they can bid up to that point. And they kind of ran up and then pulled back a little bit and then ran back up. And I've heard that there were no bids. I've heard that there were real bids all the way up. I've heard there were bids at 21. I don't really know the story, and it doesn't really matter. What bothers me is that if I own one of the most significant racing cars in history, and I have decided to offer it for sale, then if I don't need the money, I need to be willing to let the market dictate based on the way that I've decided to present it to that market, whether it's totally private, totally closed, or in a public auction. Why have a reserve? Just let the car sell for whatever the new person who's going to prize the car, value it, and want to use it, hopefully. I just don't like the look of the reserve. I mean, look, if you're ready to sell the car, put it out there in the marketplace, let the buyers decide what it's worth. Putting it out there with a reserve just means I kind of want to learn what it's worth so that I can update my insurance policy, but I don't want to let it go necessarily unless somebody pays the moon for it. So I didn't enjoy everything about the way that car went to market. But I am really loving the way that RM Sotheby's and the Indy Museum are collaborating to sell these cars, even as heartbreaking as it is to think that anybody could ever let them go. But I get that they want to build a new facility and focus more on cars that pertain to the Indianapolis 500, so I suppose that's all right. But we just got to watch one of the most significant automotive transactions in history with the Mercedes 196R. At an auction just a couple days ago, it sold for nearly $54 million, the most expensive Grand Prix car ever sold at auction, or at least in a public auction. And I mean, awesome to see. Very, very cool. A well-deserved number in excess of the estimate. So really, really awesome for all the parties involved, and a car that, as we talk about, has a great story.
It's one of the, I think, one of the prettiest race cars ever. It's the Streamliner version. And what they were after the war, Mercedes got back into racing early on with the 300 SLR. Then they got back into Formula One, Grand Prix racing at the time. And they built, the standard kind of, the cigar looking cars with the wheels on the outside. But in 1954, the rules weren't terribly strict on what the car was supposed to look like. And the Germans came up with this idea of making it enclosed body for it. So it had two bodies. And this is the Streamliner body. So it covers the wheels. You're still sitting in the center. We had this car at Canepa that the Indy Museum sent it to us to help kind of revive it, as we did for the 250 LM. And you sit in the center of the car. Your legs are out like this. The pedals are out here because there is a straight 8 canted right in front of you. But the bodywork, which is all magnesium, which is absolutely gorgeous and almost impossible to work on, the magnesium body just swoops down over all the wheels. This gave them a huge advantage on the faster tracks. This car was driven by Fangio. It was driven by Sterling Moss. It has very significant racing history. Raced at Monza, back when Monza had that giant curved part of the track was still in function. And there's pictures of the Streamliner up there. It's an incredibly significant piece of history. Even more so that it was given to the Indianapolis Museum in the early 60s as kind of like a present that you're happy opening a museum. How about a nice Mercedes? We don't use it anymore. So the history of that car is absolutely known. It wasn't destroyed or burnt down. It's been at the museum all these years. It's been on display. It is one of the perfect Mercedes race cars.
Exactly. An amazing car with an amazing story that achieved a very, very impressive number, almost $54 million. But you mentioned Sterling Moss had driven that car. And there is another car having been driven by Sterling Moss. The D-Type is coming up for sale. Talk about the D-Type.
So the Jaguar D-Type was kind of the same era, 50s, as the 196. This wasn't a Formula One car. It was an endurance car. And it was, in the 50s, the endurance car. It was the 917 of the 1950s. It won Le Mans in 55, 56, and 57. Now, the car that's up for sale is another very well-known car. It was built for the team in 1954. It was at Le Mans in 54. It did not win, but it raced. It was a significant car in their collection for a few years that they raced it and it was sold on. But this is a certifiable raced D-Type. A few years ago in 2018, it was up for sale. And I believe they were looking for 12 to 15 million dollars for this car, and it was a no sale then. And what's interesting is that the current, estimate price, and it's a no reserve auction, which I think is a smart idea, is between 6.5 million and 8.5 million. So the expectation of this car in the last 7 years has dropped significantly.
And I hate to see that because, the car is no less awesome today than it was back then. There's just a smaller pool of buyers pumping 7 or even 8 figures of money into cars this significant, I think. And it's not that you couldn't sell a Zonda for that or, a McLaren F1. It's just a matter of that's just doesn't seem to be the taste of the new crop of car collectors. Like you said, I am very, very pleased that it is a no reserve auction because this is a bad look. Like, this is an empirical documentation of the change in tastes and values of a car that is always going to be one of the blue chip legendary race cars. That if you want to own the coolest Jaguar on earth, this is probably it.
Like, if I had an enormous amount of money, I'd have a D-Type. I've only gotten to driven a recreation of one, and that was enough for me. For lifelong, that is the car I want. Now, what's interesting about the D-Type, and this is more about Jaguar than other brands, is that the range of prices in these is extreme. You can find D-Types having been sold for $2-3 million, and for a long time that was the number. The 1956 Le Mans winning D-Type sold for $21 million a few years ago. So you have a range of $2 to $21 million, and it's physically the same car. So really what you're buying in a D-Type is its history. And does this car fall kind of in between, a never race, nobody car to the Le Mans winning car? Probably. That's probably where they came up with that higher number back in the day when that car sold for 21 million. They figured this has got to be worth 14. But I think actually they're much more realistic with kind of an $8 million number.
I hope so, and I hope to see the car bring great money. I hope to continue to see these significant cars not only sell for the proper money, but go to the right home. And that's what I'm most excited about in the next, chapter of car collecting, which fortunately, even though I'm not going to be out there bidding, I do feel like a participant just based on VINwiki, based on the stories that we're curating, and based on the chance to kind of interact with these cars when they show up at events, because we need to preserve the stories. We need to preserve the history. We need to preserve the enthusiasm for these cars to make sure that they go on. I mean, even with cars like my Bugatti, which is not a historically significant car, but just based on its age, the fact that it's got so much celebrity provenance, you feel much more like a momentary caretaker than you do like an owner. Because that car will be restored 10 times over the next 100 years, I hope, and continue to be in use at events, driving fast, going out, and things like that, the same way a Duesenberg or something like that is today. And, the enthusiasm for Duesenbergs is a lot less now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they are still fantastic and they still take your breath away, regardless of how much you know about that specific car, even about the brand, every time you see one on the lawn at a car show or hopefully screaming by you on the highway. And so I'm excited to see what these cars do, and I'm excited to see what happens, but I really think it's important for all car collectors to not take lightly what it means to own one of these cars and the optics of the purchase and of the sale. There's a lot of great stakeholders here, and even for all of the fees and everything that would be involved in some of these auctions, generally I do believe that is how you ought to sell one. It's important for the market at large to see how the values move over time, and it is the most legitimate way to find out who will pay the most for a car, as long as they're advertised. And RM sent out the most beautiful catalog I've seen of the Indy cars and the other things that are coming up. And so they're doing it the right way. I don't know if it's the right time, but it'll be fun to see what they bring. Thank you, John. Any parting thoughts for us?
No, I think you wrapped it up beautifully. This is really about the continuation of the stories and the history of these cars, because that's what the value is in these vehicles, are the stories. So as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we keep showing these cars, as long as we keep them in the public eye and people enjoying them, they'll live on forever.
Exactly. And once again, I want to thank Auto Tempest for supporting this video, making so much content on VINwiki possible, and for being the best place to shop for your next car. So please check them out right now. Right now, scroll down, click the link in the description below, browse on over to Auto Tempest, and see what you can find out there. It's a great way just to see what your car ought to be worth because you get all the results so easily and so quickly. Autotempest.com, all the cars, one search.